Hello friends, welcome to my channel, Recap Stories. Today, we talk about a story that begins with a man named Chris, who is on his way to drop his son, Johnny, at daycare. His wife, Linda, also works, so it's hard to manage time for the child, especially since he is still young and cannot take care of himself. On the way, Johnny reminds his father that his birthday is coming up in a few weeks and that he has already made a wish list. Chris reassures him that he would love to see the list and would try his best to fulfill it, but at the same time, he explains that sometimes sacrifices are necessary because something better may be written for him. As Chris drops Johnny off at daycare and comes out, we see that he is carrying a device box. It is an advanced type of X-ray machine that he had purchased a few days ago. This machine is 3 times more expensive than regular machines, but there is no significant difference in performance. He is going from place to place, hoping someone will buy it because if he cannot sell at least 2 machines in a month, he will not be able to cover household expenses, his son's fees, and other necessities. On the other hand, Linda is working double shifts, but she is tired of the situation. She often taunts Chris for his failures, and he helplessly listens to her complaints. One day, when they receive a notice for their house taxes, Linda turns red with anger. Meanwhile, when Chris returns home, he finds that his car has been towed for parking violations. As soon as he reaches home, Linda reminds him about the tax notice and tells him to pay it by the next day. But Chris doesn't have the money, so he changes the subject. Later that night, he starts solving a new cube puzzle that has recently come to the market and solves it easily. The next day, he sets out to sell his machine. On the way, he spots a red Ferrari and asks the person who gets out of it what he does for a living. The person laughs and says he is a bank stockbroker. Chris wonders if he too should go back to college to learn this profession. He realizes that not every job requires formal education. Some people succeed just by using their skills. With this thought, he starts observing everyone coming and going into the building. After a while, Chris smiles and makes a big decision in his life, to become a stockbroker. He rushes to tell Linda about his decision, but she mocks him, saying, "You only completed high school and you're dreaming of becoming a stockbroker. First, do your current job properly." This comment touches Chris's heart, and the next day, he leaves his machine with some street artists and goes into the building to get the necessary forms to become a stockbroker. When he goes to take the form, he notices that some people are stealing his machine. Chris immediately runs after them, but they manage to escape. When he returns home, Linda assumes that Chris has sold the machine, so she happily praises him. However, when she sees another machine in his hands, an argument breaks out between them. This has become an everyday occurrence. Every day, after working hard outside, Chris would return home to hear his wife's taunts and feel embarrassed in front of his daughter. After a short while, he gives his daughter a football for her birthday, which makes her very happy. Chris tries to make peace with Linda, but she says, "I no longer believe anything you say. Do whatever you want, I don't care." A month passes, but there is no response to the form. Despite his disappointment, Chris stands outside the building waiting for Jay. Jay is in a hurry and doesn't listen to Chris, rushing ahead. Taking advantage of the situation, Chris gets into the taxi with Jay, but Jay is too focused on solving the cube to pay attention to Chris. Chris takes the cube from him and solves it in just a few minutes, impressing Jay. However, before the conversation ends, Jay gets out of the taxi and leaves. Without enough money for the taxi fare, Chris rushes to catch a train, but unfortunately, his machine is left behind. He tries to retrieve it but fails. Late at night, when he calls Linda, he finds out that she is taking Johnny with her. Upon hearing this, he abandons everything and rushes home, but by then, it's too late. Linda has already left. Meanwhile, Chris receives a call from Jay, who, impressed by Chris's abilities, tells him to contact his secretary. Chris quickly grabs paper and a pen from a store and writes down the number. The next day, he goes to Linda and says, "If you want to leave, you can, but Johnny will stay with me." Linda, furious, storms off. When Chris returns home with Johnny, the landlord arrives at the door and tells him that due to not paying rent for the past 3 months, he must vacate the house. Chris asks for a few more days, promising to paint the house, and the landlord agrees. The next day, Chris drops Johnny off at daycare and starts painting the house. And friends, they say that when a person's luck is bad, nothing can save them. That's exactly what happened to Chris. While he was busy with work, the police arrived and arrested him for not paying the "no parking" fine. Although he was ready to go pay the fine right away, the problem was that the cash counter wouldn't open until 9 a.m. Chris was surprised by this, as his interview was scheduled for 9:15 a.m. He tried to explain his situation to the police, but they were unwilling to listen. Reluctantly, he called Linda, asking her to take Johnny to school because he was in a tight spot. Finally, when the counter opened, Chris paid the fine, and despite being in dirty clothes, he rushed to the interview. During the interview, Chris was introduced to the world of stockbroking, which was a new experience for him. As soon as the interview began, the first question was about his appearance. Chris honestly answered that he had been sitting outside thinking of a good lie about his appearance, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. He explained that he had been arrested due to the "no parking" fine. The interviewers were surprised, as they considered it a trivial matter. However, Chris humorously remarked, "Sir, not everyone finds this trivial." He then went on to explain that he was always at the top of his class, even though there were only 12 students in his class. Chris tried to impress the interview panel, but had not achieved much success. Finally, he gave an emotional speech, saying he wanted to learn because he had seen poverty, witnessed his family fall apart, and endured his wife's harsh words for years. Still, he never gave up. Hearing this, Martin, the head of the interview panel, asked, "If someone came for an interview wearing just a shirt, would you hire them?" Chris smiled and replied, "Maybe they would have worn good pants." Everyone laughed, and Martin chose him. When Chris returned home and told Linda everything, she still didn't believe him and said she was taking Johnny with her. Chris tried to stop her, saying Johnny would stay with him. Linda left crying. The next day, Chris took his belongings and went to stay in a cheap hotel since he still couldn't find a way to collect rent money. During this time, Johnny says, "I want to be a volleyball player." In response, the teacher says, "You can never become one." Hearing this, Johnny gets upset and throws the volleyball. Chris goes to him and gives him a valuable piece of advice: never tell anyone that you can't do something. Instead, always say, "Yes, I can do it," and then work hard to prove everyone wrong. A few days later, Chris sells a machine, collects some money, and pays Johnny's daycare fees. Johnny's training begins, and during the training, a teacher tells everyone, "The senior will select only one person from among you." Once, someone scored 97% in the exam, but still failed because an exam alone isn't enough. You have to show your abilities. These words become a challenge for Chris. He didn't have much knowledge about the job, and his education wasn't great either. On top of that, his team leader kept him tangled in personal tasks, making it difficult for Chris to find time for himself. But instead of complaining, Chris found his own solution: hard work. While the team completed tasks in 9 hours, Chris finished the same work in 6 hours. He worked so tirelessly that he wouldn't drink water or go to the bathroom during work, just to avoid wasting time. Despite this, he didn't achieve any major success. Eventually, he calls his best client, and the client invites him over in 2 hours. Chris hurries to leave, but his team leader stops him and tells him to park his car, causing him to miss the opportunity. After returning to the hotel, the manager asks him to pay the rent, but Chris requests 2 days to make the payment. Meanwhile, He learns that his client is going to watch a volleyball match. Seizing the chance, Chris goes to his client's house and apologizes for being late. The client, impressed by Chris's honesty, invites him to watch the match in the VIP stand. This was a huge moment for Chris, but his son immediately agrees to go. During the match, the client tells him, "I like you, but that doesn't mean I'll invest in your company." Yet another opportunity slips through Chris's fingers. But he doesn't give up. He spends the whole night reflecting on his mistakes and planning how to improve them. Chris's difficulties kept escalating. One day, he received a tax notice stating that all the money in his bank account had been frozen because he had failed to pay taxes. When Chris learned about it, he tried calling to explain, but to no avail. Meanwhile, while sitting in the park, Chris spotted the same beggar who had stolen his machine at the station. Chris immediately went to the beggar and got his machine back. He tried selling it everywhere but eventually found a buyer. Unfortunately, the machine had already broken down. Chris made every effort to repair it but failed. When he returned to the hotel, another crisis awaited him. His belongings were thrown outside the hotel because he couldn't pay the rent. When his son, Johnny, saw this, he thought someone was kicking them out of their house. Johnny, angry, began hitting the gate, prompting Chris, for the first time in his life, to shout at him. Chris went to a friend's house for help, but no one could assist him. He then took his son to the railway station, where they had to spend the night in a public toilet. This was the toughest moment of Chris's life. He cried helplessly in front of his son, something he had never felt before. The next day, Chris went to a church that offered accommodation for the poor. He had to stand in a long line to get a spot. Luckily, he was able to find a place. While staying there, he tried to fix his broken machine, but a crucial part was damaged, and he didn't have the money to buy it. Chris's troubles were escalating. He had to finish his work quickly and join the queue because if he missed it, he would have to sleep outside. This was the hardest and most painful period of his life, one he might never forget. The next day, Chris had to take an internship exam, but his face showed no happiness because life's struggles had exhausted him. Chris didn't perform well in the exam, and that same day, he couldn't even find a spot in the church line. He was forced to sleep on a train that night. The next day, in a desperate decision, he sold his blood to raise money to buy the broken part for his machine. After purchasing the part, he managed to repair the machine and sold it. The money he earned allowed him to spend a peaceful night in a hotel. The next day, he went to the beach with his son. Chris thought about how much pain he had endured, and how much of it his son had shared as well. He silently promised that if he ever succeeded, he would share the credit with his 12-year-old son, because when the world rejected him, his son always stood by him. That same day, the result of Chris's internship was due. He went to the office wearing a new shirt, which his supervisor, Martin, praised. Chris mentioned that this was his last day in the building, and he didn't want to come in wearing ordinary clothes like he did on the first day. Martin told him that he could wear the same clothes tomorrow because from now on, he would be sitting in that same cabin. Hearing this, tears of joy filled Chris's eyes. Martin also returned the $5 Chris had asked for. Chris walked out of the office, overwhelmed with happiness, and said to himself, "This is the happiest moment of my life." He moved into a new apartment with his son. At the end of the story, it is mentioned that Chris, through his hard work, not only achieved success but also founded a multi-million-dollar brokerage firm. He first bought a house for his daughter. He dedicated all his success to his son because his son had never let him down and stood by him in every hardship. As a poet beautifully said, "When fate is cruel, it seeks its destiny, the oyster looks for a stone to collide with in the sea." How did you like the story? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I request you to help me reach 10,000 subscribers on my channel soon. We hope you enjoyed this video and will like it. Please subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much for your kind comments. See you in the next video.